We're in Acts chapter 2, and the first question, it's kind of a long one, but here we go. Even though they had seen miracle after miracle and heard from Jesus' own mouth that he would die and resurrect, the disciples didn't believe when they were first told of Jesus' resurrection, according to Luke 24:11, and the other Gospels also record this. Why do you think that these 3,000 people here in Acts chapter 2 were so quickly convinced? And the point is that the disciples, again, having been with Jesus for so long, having heard from him that he was going to die and resurrect, when they were told, they did not believe those who told them. Particularly Thomas said that he wouldn't believe unless he could physically touch the nail prints and put his hand in Jesus' side before he would believe. But these people, not seeing Jesus, not touching Jesus after his death, seem to be convinced so quickly and so easily. I think this highlights a very important point of faith, of how faith is established. And it's the point that faith is not established generally. It's, well, I'll actually say it's not established ever based on one experience or based on one fact or based on one piece of evidence. Faith is established based on a multitude of experiences, a multitude of facts, a multitude of evidence being put together and then being brought home to the heart at one point generally. That's how faith, I believe, is established. And let me highlight what I mean from this story. First, the first bit of evidence that these people will see here, at least in the story, is the miracle of the speaking in tongues. In chapter 2, Acts chapter 2, it says, verse 7, utterly amazed, the people asked, are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in his own native language? And then they go on and list the different kinds of people who were there, the different languages that they spoke. And verse 12, amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? So this is, I think, the first bit of evidence that's coming to them that something's going on here. Something supernatural is happening here. And the people are called to try and figure out, what is it? What's happening? But again, this is not on its own. This is not alone. This is not enough to establish faith. Then Peter stands up and addresses the crowd, and he goes into detail about the prophet Joel, who prophesied of the Spirit being poured out in the last days. So now you have this very amazing event that's taking place. Then Peter joins that with the fact that this was already prophesied from before. So that's actually adding to the basket of evidence. You have the fact of what's going on, but then you say, wow, this was actually prophesied by God. Again, building a case that something very important is happening here. Then he begins to preach in verse 22. Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. Now, this is interesting. He's building on the fact that these people already had a prior knowledge of Jesus as well. He doesn't even try and debate it. He says, you know that he was a man accredited by God. You know that there was something different about this guy, Jesus. And just to echo that, if we go back to John chapter 3, when Nicodemus comes to meet Jesus at night, verse 2, he came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know, not just I, but we know you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you are doing if God were not with him. So the leaders of the Jews particularly, and these people, just as Peter is saying, they knew that there was something different about Jesus. So we have, again, a case building. We have this supernatural event that is very difficult to explain by natural means. Then you have a prophecy that is being fulfilled in this supernatural event. And then you have the bringing into remembrance of the fact that Jesus was someone from God. Then he goes and says that this man was killed. But then he brings back some more prophecy, more scripture, and says that David spoke about him in verse 25. And going through verse 25 down to 28, he quotes from Psalm chapter 16, and quotes that David is talking about him. Then he explains or interprets his application of this prophecy starting in verse 29. And most importantly, I want to highlight this, verse 32. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. So he says that what David prophesied was that the Messiah would die, but would not be left in the grave and would be resurrected. So again, the case is continuing to mount. He's saying now that Jesus was killed. Everyone knew that. Jesus was from God. Everyone knew that. But now he's saying that he, again, I just read it there, that we all are witnesses of the fact. We're telling you something hard to believe, that Jesus resurrected from the dead. However, you have also a prophecy of the scriptures that they probably didn't understand before, but he puts in a very plain light that it seems that David is not talking about himself, but talking about the Messiah who would come from his descendants, that he was resurrected from the dead. So again, the case is building, more and more evidence. And then finally, going down to verse 37, it says, when the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, brothers, what shall we do? And so again, I believe that it wasn't just one point, it wasn't just one evidence, it wasn't just one experience, but all of these things put together built the case that maybe something's going on here, and particularly maybe that what these guys are saying is true. And based on that, they took the leap of faith, and trusted in Jesus, and trusted in the word that the disciples were preaching to them. What does it say to us? I believe all of us are similar in this. It's not just faith actually that works this way. It's not just our relationship or our belief in God that works this way. Just in general, if you're married, the reason you believe your spouse loves you is not because of one thing. You wouldn't point to one thing and say, well, because he or she did that or said that, that's how I know he or she loves me. No, there are many things that happen over a course of time that confirm to you, wow, they do love me. Even if you're not married, if you have a friend, the reason you believe that your friends are loyal to you is not just one thing. There are many things that have happened over the course of time, adding to the basket of evidence. And then because of the full basket of evidence, then you have made the leap of faith and said, I do believe this person is my friend, that this person is loyal to me, it does care for me. And so again, this is how we evaluate reality. I think what this can help us to do is to validate our faith and to even maintain our faith. Things will come to challenge our faith. That's inevitable in the life of the Christian. But what is it that our faith was built on in the first place? It's this basket of evidence. And I think what we can do, even before we reach times of trials of our faith, is to review what are the things that are in my basket of evidence. The things that are in my basket are going to be different from the things that are in your basket. The things that are in your basket are different from the things that are in mine or someone else's basket. Each of us individually has our basket of evidence, has the groupings of experiences, of teachings, of the lessons that we've learned, the things that have established our faith. And what I believe is good for us to do, and it's not my opinion, the Bible itself also says that we ought to meditate on his works. Think on the things that God has done for us. Think on the things that have established our faith. That often we should review those things, recount those things, retell the stories to ourselves, tell them to someone else, so that we can be reminded of why we have put our trust in God, why we have put our trust in Jesus. And I think this can help us so that when things come to try or to challenge that faith, that our faith will remain strong. Let's go to the next question. Number 2, it's after their conversion of the 3,000 people, what 4 things did the new believers continue in or devote themselves to? And that's depending on your translation. The answer is in verse 42 of Acts 2. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, that's 1, and to the fellowship, that's 2, to the breaking of bread, 3, and to prayer. And I believe these 4 things do a good job of giving a broad picture of what the Christian life is composed of, the elements of our religion that should be strong. And I think, again, we all understand these things individually, but I think we all could use a refresher or a review. How am I doing in these 4 areas? Again, there are other areas as well of Christianity, but I think this again gives a nice broad view of some very important areas. How are we doing in our devotion, devoting ourselves, that is, to the apostles' teaching. That's pretty plain. These the New Testament, the words and the teachings of the apostle. And of course, we could extend that to the teachings of the Bible in general. How are we doing in devoting ourselves to the Bible, to personal time in the Bible, not just listening to sermons, not just listening to videos like you're doing right now, not just hearing it from other people, but personally taking time, reading the Bible, giving ourselves to studying the scriptures. And that's one area of our Christianity. The second area here is to fellowship. This is something we often reduce to just attending a worship service once a week. No, fellowship is more than that. Fellowship is socializing, interacting with other believers. And I'm sure we all know that it's helpful when you have other Christians in your life, Christians that can encourage you in your faith, that can relate to you when you're excited, or when you're telling a story, or that they can be excited with you when you're telling a story of how God has been good to you, or Christians that can be in your life to kind of rebuke you when you're not doing the things you should, or can give you kind of a refocus on areas that you may be lacking in. But all of us need to have in our lives Christian fellowship, and we need to keep maintaining that Christian fellowship. We need to spend time with other believers, because that's a part of the design of Christianity, to keep us close to Christ. The next area is the breaking of bread. This is most likely a reference to the Lord's Supper, the breaking of the bread that Jesus says represented the breaking of his body. And they kept this at the center of their religion. They did it often. And Jesus says, as often as you do this, you're proclaiming my death until I come. That's in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul quoting from what Jesus said at the Lord's Supper when he instituted it. Then Paul says that as often as we do it, we're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. So at the center of their religion was a remembrance of the death of Jesus and what it meant to them personally. Again, this is to be a component of our Christianity. How often are we meditating on the fact that Jesus humbled himself to death, and even the death of the cross, for our sake, that he was willing to sacrifice all for us. And of course, that drives us to be willing to sacrifice all for him. And again, keeping that at the center of our religion is important, as we see here. And finally, they devoted themselves to prayer. They devoted themselves to prayer. And I believe that's both personal prayer, opening their hearts to God, sharing with him their own doubts, their own uncertainties, their own sorrows, their own joys, as well as sharing with God the good things that are going on in their life, as well as asking God for help, asking God for the grace that they would need to make it through the challenges of their new belief, and making it through the challenges that come through life. But these four areas, it says that they devoted themselves to these areas. And again, hopefully we can just take an inventory. How are we doing in these four areas in our Christianity? And I believe that can be a helpful gauge, and a helpful also way to show us where we may need improvement.